In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 8, where last chapter we started our examination and explanation of business cycles. Now, in this chapter, we will look at aggregate demand a bit more carefully by considering aggregate demand data, to then look at the consumption function and investment function, where with respect to today, in looking at aggregate demand data, we will do this by considering GDP decomposition data in the form of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports, from which we will conclude with a summary. With all this in mind, beginning with our preliminaries, thus far in developing our explanation of business cycles, we developed the ADAS model as a representation of the aggregate product market of an economy, from which we developed how to represent business cycle points through the ADAS model, in which if an economy was in a short-run equilibrium state that had an unemployment gap, this would correspond to a trough, while if an economy had a short-run equilibrium state occurring in which there is an inflationary gap, this would correspond to a peak, in which we then explained recoveries to peaks and contractions to troughs via shocks, where we saw how demand shocks could replicate the co-movements in our data, more precisely the negative short-run relationship between the unemployment rate with the inflation rate, where based upon this observation, we now want to look at aggregate demand a bit more carefully, as this can give us greater understanding on the sources of demand shocks in an economy, as well as perhaps provide us some insights in terms of how an economy goes from a short-run equilibrium state back to a long-run equilibrium state. So with this in mind, to look at aggregate demand a bit more carefully, this means looking at consumer, firm, government, and foreign agent expenditures a bit more carefully, or means revisiting the GDP decomposition in the form of GDP being the sum of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports, where the way that we'll approach this recall is by turning to our annual 1948 through 2021 U.S. data provided from the St. Louis Federal Reserve and determine which of these agent expenditures we will focus on, in which the criteria that we will use in terms of determining which expenditures we should focus on will be the portion of real GDP the account comprises, as well as how strong the pro-cyclical relationship between that variable with real GDP is. So with this in mind, let us begin with consumption, where with respect to consumption, we've seen that real consumption on average comprised 62% of real GDP in the United States during the 1948 through 2021 period, in which 62% is a sizable portion of real GDP. Additionally, when we converted the data into percentage change form, looking at 1949 through 2021, when we looked at percentage change run plot, we saw that the percentage change in real GDP would move with the percentage change in real consumption. And when we looked at our scatter plot, we saw that there was a clear linear positive relationship between the two variables, indicating a pro-cyclical variable, where if we were to also calculate the correlation coefficient, we would find a value of positive 0.72. With the value being positive, this would indicate pro-cyclical, and with the value being closer to 1 than it is to 0, this would indicate a strongly pro-cyclical variable. So based upon real consumption being a sizable portion of real GDP and also being strongly pro-cyclical, then we should look at consumption a bit more carefully, in that it seems reasonable if that there's a sizable change in consumption, there will be a sizable change in GDP. Therefore, understanding how changes in consumption occur will give us a deeper understanding of demand shocks, and it also seems reasonable to say that changes in consumption will be a major source of demand shocks in an economy as well, particularly with that of the US, given that this is the data set that we are looking at. Now, moving on to investment, we've seen that real investment is on average 14% of real GDP. So a smaller portion than consumption, but still a sizable portion of real GDP nonetheless for the 1948 through 2021 period, where afterwards, after converting the data into percentage change form, looking at 1949 through 2021, we saw that the percentage change in real investment would move with the percentage change in real GDP, and we saw further evidence of this when looking at our scatter plot, in which we had a clear positive linear relationship between the two variables, in which if we were to also calculate the correlation coefficient, we would yield a positive 0.80 value, With the value being positive, this indicates pro-cyclical, and with the value being closer to 1 than it is to 0, this would indicate strongly pro-cyclical. So, given that real investment is also a sizable portion of real GDP and strongly pro-cyclical, we should also take a closer look at investment, in that it seems reasonable to conclude that if there's a sizable change in investment, there will be a sizable change in GDP as well. So understanding how investment changes will give us a deeper understanding of demand shocks, and it also seems reasonable to say that changes in investment will also be a major source of demand shocks in an economy, particularly that of the US as well. Now, moving on to government expenditures, we've seen that real government expenditures on average comprise 26% of real GDP for the United States during the 1948 through 2021 period, where once again this is a sizable portion of real GDP, just as we concluded with consumption and investment. However, after converting the data into percentage change form and looking at 1949 through 2021, when looking at the percentage change run plot, we saw how real government expenditures could move with and against real GDP, indicating some acyclic behavior. We also saw this in our scatter plot, in which we generated a mostly horizontal cluster of points in which there was a slight upward trend, so we concluded a weakly procyclical variable, where if we were to also calculate the correlation coefficient, we would generate a positive 0.16, where with the value being positive, this indicates procyclical, but with the value being closer to 0 than it is to 1, it would be weakly procyclical. So based upon the observation of real government expenditures being a sizable portion of real GDP, we should be able to account for it, but given that it is weakly procyclical and has some acyclical tendencies when looking at a percentage change run plot, what we'll do is we will forego looking at government expenditures a bit more carefully, and we will assume that government expenditures are determined outside the model. And the reason for this is that it seems reasonable to say that the government manages the economy in terms of they will choose how they spend based upon the performance of an economy at a given moment of time. So then, based upon this, we will examine this further when we discuss policy in Unit 3 of the course. Now, lastly, what we have is net exports, in which we've seen that real net exports on average comprises minus 2% of real GDP in the United States for the 1948 through 2021 period, which is a trivial amount of real GDP compared to our other three accounts. And when converting the data into percentage change form and looking at 1949 through 2021 and looking at the percentage change run plot, we saw that real net exports were rather volatile and could move with and against real GDP. We saw further evidence of this when looking at our scatter plot, in which we had a mostly horizontal cluster of points with a slight upward trend, which led us to conclude a weakly procyclical variable, in which if we were to also calculate the correlation coefficient, we would generate a positive 0.07. With the value being positive, this indicates procyclical, but with the value being closer to 0 than it is to 1, this would lead us to conclude a weakly procyclical variable. So, with real net exports being a trivial amount of real GDP and also being weakly procyclical, we will forego looking at net exports a bit more carefully. However, if we were to look at net exports a bit more carefully, what we would do is we would develop a trade model by incorporating a second economy in our ADAS model, but as mentioned, we will forego this approach. So to summarize what we saw then in terms of our GDP decomposition data, what we'll do is we'll look at consumption and investment a bit more carefully, in that they are sizable portions of real GDP and are strongly procyclical, in that if there's a change in one of these accounts, there will be a sizable change in real GDP, which is our evidence for these two accounts being major sources of demand shocks in an economy. Now, with respect to government expenditures, given that it's a sizable portion of real GDP, but weakly procyclical and has some acyclical tendencies, what we'll do is we will forego looking at government expenditures a bit more carefully until we develop policy in Unit 3 of the course. And lastly, with respect to net exports, we will forego looking at this account a bit more carefully, where if we were to look at this account, it would mean developing a trade model. So then, based upon all this information, where we'll pick up in our next video is we'll look at consumption a bit more carefully by developing the consumption function.